Hello everyone, it is February 4th, 2020, and you're listening to episode 5 of the Mid-Season Replacements Podcast. I am your host, Randy Dankievitch, the man behind TV Never Sleeps and the TV editor of GoombaStomp.com. Returning this week, my good co-host, Sean Colletti, back from his most recent secret undercover mission that we're not allowed to talk about. What's up, man?
Not much. Thanks for having me. Apologies to listeners. I know we're early on in the reboot of this podcast, and some consistency would be nice, but circumstances were about as extenuating as they get last week. But I am here, and I will remain here.
And that's what Ricky's for, you know? We can always count on Ricky to come fill in.
Absolutely. Ricky's got a lot of crazy theories, you know. He always makes these predictions early on in the seasons of things, and then I feel like he makes so many of them that I forget some of them. So when he says like, "Oh, I got this right," like I just have to take his word for it that was only like the one thing that he said about that thing.
Well, that's what I like, is that it's one of the things I'd always enjoy about Ricky, is that his passion comes through in every sense of his expression of it for a show or a movie or something. Is that I believe him when he tells me that he experiences an emotional extreme of some sort with anything he experiences, because I think he really does buy into it that much, and it is something I've always admired about him.
We need more people, I think, to view art in that way, because I think we moved away from the emotional component a bit, which is what we're here for.
Yeah, we joke around a lot that Ricky and I, that I don't enjoy art as much as he does, and there are days when I think that he is right. Anyway, enough about our editor-in-chief. I don't want to get fired today. If you'd like to reach the show, you can get to us at midseasonreplacements@gmail.com. If you have questions you want to read on air, we had a question last week. If you have any comments, corrections, if you need to tell us that we're wrong about something, like anyone, we'd love to hear that. Please let us know. Also, any musicians out there that want to get featured on the show, please feel free to send us anything. We're happy to promote you on the show. We have some people working on music for us right now that we've heard a little bit of that I think is starting to sound really dope. So that'll be on here soon too. What else? Yeah, the internet. If you want to follow us on the internet, I'm at RJ Dank on Twitter. The show's at Midseason Pod. We're on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, all the internet stuff. You know about the internet. We're on the internet. So let's talk about television. I'm done doing housekeeping today. I'm keeping a dirty house. We are going to talk about a few series finales. It seems like I can't remember a time like this in a long time that we've had multiple big iconic kind of not decade-defining series, but very popular shows end all at the same time. And within a week, we had the CW's Arrow end after 8 seasons. NBC's critical darling The Good Place ended. And then Netflix's BoJack Horseman, a show that we've both enjoyed and discussed multiple times over the years, bowed out with its final 8-episode run on Friday. So we're it feels like it's not really the end of an era, but it kind of feels like the end of an era, and I think the similarities between the 3 finales really give it that feel. Yeah, we're going to talk about the ends of TV shows. So obviously, 2020, I shouldn't have to do this, but I'm going to. We are going to spoil the shit out of these shows. You haven't seen the end of them, you don't want them ruined, you probably shouldn't listen to the show.
It's even more odd that this happened in the mid-season, which is our namesake, which is wonderful.
It was for us. It was an honor. It was a tribute.
It really is, because it used to be, because scripted television was dominated by the networks, this kind of coalescence of endings would happen at the end of the normal network season. And then once we transitioned into cable stuff and premium cable, I guess HBO tends to air their heavy hitters at the beginning of summer, and they kind of last until the beginning of autumn. So there'll be a lot of endings in like October. So this is unusual.
It's very unusual to have 3 shows of any kind of end on the same week. It's weird. You know, you think This is obviously bound to happen with 400 something shows on television, but the length of shows, BoJack and Arrow both ran for over 5 years. The Good Place was the kind of show that 5 years ago would have been canceled. The 3 episodes in, it's a weird conflagration of circumstances that bring these 3 shows together. But hey, we're going to seize on that opportunity. I guess we'll kind of go in chronological order. That might be the most logical way, and then we'll kind of talk about where these finales overlap in theme and content. So the first series finale to end was Arrow's Fade Out, aired January 28th. I'm throwing a date out there because I don't remember offhand, and I am a poor preparer, so I don't have it in front of me. But, the whole 8th season of Arrow is kind of a finale episode, because with the events of Elseworlds last year denoting that he was going to die during the next crossover, and knowing where the next crossover was posited, this was the Monitor, the big central character of Crisis, is a part of the 7th season of Arrow, so it's only natural that the 8th season is kind of a round of farewells, which is an interesting way to construct the final season. It's kind of taken a victory lap, but it's not, I would argue that it's one that doesn't feel particularly indulgent. And then there's the Crisis episode, and then there's a reboot spin-off episode for Green Arrow and the Canaries, which I wrote about at Goomba Stomp. And then we get to Fade Out, which is kind of the Avengers Endgame final scene of Arrow played out over 25 minutes.
Yeah, that was one of the comparisons that jumped out immediately to me with the ending of Arrow. The other series in this universe, The Flash, Supergirl, Legends of Tomorrow, Batgirl,
Black Lightning.
Yeah, these are continuing beyond this. And the MCU continues beyond Avengers Endgame. But this is also kind of what it has felt like everything's been building up to. So Endgame concluded many characters' stories, and presumably they won't be a part of that universe anymore, at least with those actors, those versions.
And kills off the character that kind of birthed the whole universe as well, just as Arrow does.
Exactly, yeah. And now the flagship series for this universe is done. So the ending of Arrow signals more than just an ending, I think, for these characters, for these actors in these roles. And it's kind of gone out quietly into the good night, because most people, I think, jumped ship early on, or else put more of their attention at first into Flash, and then, as you've said, which I've not been able to experience yet, that Legends of Tomorrow has gotten a lot better, and that's kind of been the one that they enjoyed out of this universe.
Well, there's just so much of it now, too. The Flash is going into its 5th or 6th season. Supergirl moved over from CBS and is now in its 4th or 5th season. Legends of Tomorrow's 5th season, already renewed for 6th. Black Lightning's in its 3rd season. They did the few animated specials. I mean, this universe has gotten enormous. In a lot of ways, it's larger than the Avengers universe. Think about the Avengers universe. We're talking, I don't know, like 20 to 40 movies, somewhere in that range. I don't know the exact number of what it is. So we're talking maybe, all encompassing, we're talking probably 60, 70, maybe 80 hours of material all said and done. And with the Arrowverse, we are at, 400 and counting. It's hard to, Arrow ran for 150 plus episodes. The Flash is over 100 episodes. Supergirl's close or over it as well. Like, this is an enormous universe full of characters, and it's interesting, the whole experiment of this final season in Crisis and intertwining a major crossover event with the kind of the end of your most iconic character is an interesting way to, just an interesting thought experiment in a lot of ways. And I think they mostly did a great job with it. Fade Out is really interesting because it doesn't really have Oliver Queen in it at all. Stephen Amell doesn't appear until the episode's final scene. There may be a couple moments where you see him in flashbacks and whatnot, but he's been dead for multiple episodes at this point. And a lot of this is kind of Berlanti and company resetting the table for the future. I feel like the whole episode is about all of these characters and what their next chapters look like in a lot of ways that, where I think the Avengers Endgame argument becomes a bit simplistic as in how these stories end, in a lot of, Avengers has a few notes that tease toward characters going off in different directions. Oh, the Guardians of the Galaxy are going off with this character, or Wanda and Scarlet Witch are going off to Disney Plus to have a series, or shit like that, or whatever. Oh, the Sam Wilson's Captain America. But for the big characters, that was the end. Captain America got an ending, Iron Man got an ending. Thor will obviously stay around because he's part of the spinoff thing. But I feel like all of Green Arrow's ending is about where their characters are going, save for Oliver and Felicity, who, if we're being realistic, are the two characters that you can't really pull into other series because A, the actors are going to be the most expensive, and B, their story's been told. I think the last 2 seasons have proved especially that as they moved to the future and showed Arrow's kid, Oliver and Felicity's kids growing up, their daughter growing up, and William, Oliver's first child, growing up, and the people they turn into, really kind of caps off their story in a way that gives these final episodes room to just do whatever. It must be very strange for people that haven't watched Arrow in years to come back and watch this finale and be like, A, who the fuck are these people? And B, why isn't Oliver in the last episode of his own series? So I can see where it's weird from that standpoint, but I think it's a mostly effective final hour for giving, the side characters, which is kind of what the strength of the Arrowverse is. It has great stars, but the reason it can be 400 hours and counting and still have interesting elements is because it just has so many rich side characters. I think that's finale highlights that, especially with, someone like Sarah Lance, who has really become the center of the Arrowverse in the absence of Oliver Queen.
I'm one of those people. I stopped watching the series after season 5, so I've been away for a few years.
I see people defending season 5. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to come out and say season 5 is bad.
Yes.
I don't understand what people think it is. It introduces so many characters and then has no idea what to do with them, and then has this weird ass. Who's a big bad that season? Is it Adrian Chase? I think it is. Yeah, because that's the season after Damien Dark. Yeah, that season is trash. I've seen people online defending it recently, and I don't understand why. Especially where season 6 is right there with Diaz, who I think is like stands right next to Deathstroke as like the great Arrow villain. So sorry for the diatribe. You may continue now. I had to throw that hot take out.
No, that's okay. It wasn't so strange, I guess. It felt nice, even being in the dark on some things coming in. I didn't see any of the crossover, which sounded like it was really successful. But the things that I liked about Arrow, I can't even say at the beginning. It was really season 2, and maybe some parts of season 3 were all there. I think, like you said, the secondary characters in this are wonderful. I think a lot of that comes down to almost impeccable casting throughout. And seeing characters like Nyssa and other cameos. We get Moira and Tommy again.
Funeral cameos.
Yeah.
It's a great place to have cameos, apparently, when you're telling a superhero story, as we're learning.
And it reminded me of what this series was like when it was at its best. And I think just as an episode, this finale works really well. It still has, I think, at the very least, a really wonderfully shot action sequence in flashback.
Yeah, that action sequence, they kind of teased that online as like, hey, we saved one for the finale, and they brought back like over a dozen stunt people that had worked on the series in the past. Like that whole scene is all the big stunt people from the history of Arrow kind of coming together to do one last scene. And I think it really shows, because if there's one memorable scene in the Arrow finale, it's that flashback fight scene. That's a phenomenally shot and performed sequence.
And it does exactly what you said, taking a victory lap without feeling indulgent. It doesn't overreach in any way.
Well, it's in service of like a totally like I couldn't even tell you what that scene was really about, except it's some flashback from like when Oliver was still crossing names out of a book. But I think, like you said, that's why it works so well, is that it's not like, hey, look at us, we're gonna do this really cool fight scene before this big showdown. It's like, no, here's just a memory that we have, and we're just gonna make it look fucking cool as hell.
And this is one of the issues I think almost all critics had with the series from the get-go, was this balance between present day and past narrative, which has been a key part of the identity of the series. And even while it was, I think, very good, the series, that aspect was always a bit iffy. Sometimes it was done well, as in the season 2 finale, where you have a past and present fight sequence happening between Oliver and Deathstroke. But more often than not, it wasn't used thematically well enough. And this finale really needed to rely on flashback quite a bit. And I think it did that well enough, I think, for me to kind of ignore any bad taste that trope used to leave in my mouth.
This is where I can kind of interject with, we were discussing off air a little bit, as I have this developing theory that that Damon Lindelof has created the template that all prestige modern series follow in their finales. And here's my chance to talk about it with Arrow, when you talk about the flashbacks and how they kind of operate within the framework of the series and the finale. Lost obviously was the show that kind of started this whole flashback fetish that television has sometimes now, because it was literally part of the formulaic episode of that series. And I think Arrow had moments where it did it well. It never did it consistently, and I think that shows in parts of the finale. But again, like Lost, Arrow also, you did flash forwards and flashed sideways and went to alternate realities and did a Groundhog Day episode where Arrow gets stuck in the same time loop for an hour straight. Like, it does a lot of the same things that Lost did. And I just think it's something, as we talk about these shows and we talk about finales and how they've gone over the years and how they've changed in this modern age, especially with something like Arrow, which is not as much an ending as it is a continuation and a tease towards what's next. Like, we need to recognize real, and what all of these shows that we're talking about pay homage to, and they all, for me, come back to the same source of the ending of Lost and the ending of Leftovers, and even to a degree with this show in particular, the ending of Watchmen.
The effect that Lost had, I think, has been maybe as impactful as any other series in popular culture.
I'd argue that Lost and its impact on television may be the greatest of the modern age. Like, you could point to Game of Thrones and what it did for budgets and the scope of a series, but I feel like in tone and content, like, Lost is the show, whether people would want to admit it or not, it's the show everybody aspires to be. And even with its ending, is, if you think about the themes of the Lost ending and forgiveness and legacy and letting go and moving on and things like that, it really has set the template for just about every big series to follow when the decade came. Because, it used to feel a lot like series finales, at least when I was growing up in the 90s and early 2000s, that, like, when you watch the series finale, it felt like something, it was a familiar, it was still in the normal formulaic construct of whatever show it was, but it felt like the end of a story, not necessarily the end of all metaphysical existence or a contemplation on said metaphysical presence and stuff like that. And I feel like Lost's absolute dedication to its existential ideas throughout the series, whether it did it consistently narratively or not, how it integrated that into its themes is something that every show has aspired to do since then, whether they're cognizant of it, whether they recognize it or will admit to it. I feel like that is what everybody is trying to be at the end. And I think even Arrow, which is a superhero show that introduces more superheroes in its final hour, really feels like, as characters contemplate, how they've changed and what Arrow has meant to them. I mean, fuck, Arrow had an island on it for 4 years, a strange mystical island. Like, what else can I say to compare the two?
I think if there's a strand of TV that is on the outside of that, it's the really character-driven prestige drama that The Sopranos initiated, and that maybe, well, it didn't really reach its end with Mad Men. I think what you're saying,
The anti-hero genre kind of began to fade with the end of Mad Men. So if you think about it, even Arrow started while Mad Men was still on, and Arrow was a show about a guy who fucking killed the shit out of a lot of people. And as that series even went on, it shifted to be more like, no, we need to consider the complexity of a human being that may sometimes kill a bunch of people.
yeah, I think Arrow and The Good Place, of the shows that we're talking about, fit that mold that you're describing. And if there is a strand that's an exception to it that has a through line from The Sopranos to The Shields to Mad Men, it would be BoJack. So we'll talk about that when we come to it. But you mentioned flash forwarding and flash sideways.
Yeah, do you need me to explain any of this, the circumstances of this finale to you? Did this make sense with Arrow's daughter being in the present and Dinah Drake driving off apparently wanting to do nothing? And did any of that raise an eyebrow for you at any point? Because honestly, the plotting of this entire universe has gone fucking batshit crazy.
Everything that was a part of this episode, I think I was able to understand to some extent without having seen the last few seasons, so that was fine.
Like Wild Dog knowing he was going to win an election before he was even nominated to go in the election. Stuff like that.
I just took that at face value and just ran with it. A lot of that stuff speaks to an issue, probably the issue that I had with the series, which is why I dropped it after so long, after a big investment. Which is really a problem with this kind of story at large. And maybe we can talk about how TV series in general deal with permanence. But in other kinds of series, a death of a character is usually something that kind of shifts the entire cast of characters. It's an event that matters. It's something that has permanent effects on the series going forward. Other kinds of events do similar things in quieter shows. So maybe, somebody going back on their sobriety, or two characters getting married, or somebody getting a promotion or losing their job. These kinds of things can have just as big of impacts.
Bubbles getting invitation upstairs for dinner.
Exactly. But then with superhero series, it's really difficult to do the death as major permanent event, because we know that it just doesn't work like that. That's not the nature of these stories, that there are cheap ways out of that. So whenever a series starts doing that, starts presenting deaths, or similar events that should have really permanent, weighty effects, and finds ways of going back on them, I just really lose interest. And I wish more writers working in this kind of genre would recognize that and not feel like they need to bend over backwards to do like puzzle trickery, or cliffhanger-y stuff, because we kind of all know that this is the stuff that happened. This is why the Dark Knight trilogy works well, is because it's only those 3 films. There's a story being told there. If a character dies, they're dead, and that matters. And it's much, much harder to do with long-form narrative on TV with this kind of stuff.
Especially on the CW, which has made its hay for decades, going back to, you name it, Charmed, Buffy, Angel, any of those series from the 90s had people that died and came back and died and came back and sometimes left and then would come back. I think there's a lot of things that play into that. There's the cameo addiction of comic book, of the inherent horniness we all have to see one hero crossover with another hero and them stand together. It's the BoJack and Mr. Peanut Butter joke just played out across 40 years of media and comic books and movies and now cinematic universes and whatnot. But I guess the thing that stands out about Arrow in the end is that, which I think argues that it does it well and also plays into what I think frustrates you about this universe, is that to kill off an iconic character, they literally had to end the entire universe to justify it to themselves. They said, okay, well, if we're going to do this, let's end the whole fucking thing and we'll let him be the sacrifice to build the new universe, because that is literally the only way we can write ourselves into a corner where we can't bring him back easily.
When they killed off Moira in the second season, that really mattered. When they killed off Tommy in the first season, that really mattered. And that momentum that they built, and the precedent that they set for these kinds of events, to have huge impacts on the rest of the characters going forward, and the stakes being set higher. Like, I loved that about Arrow. And then once you start introducing resurrection pools or time travel that can sidestep some of these things, it becomes harder to invest only when the writers are still using those things as major events. I'm not saying like, oh, everything should be like Game of Thrones and kill people. Like, that's not the only major thing that you can use at your disposal in a series like this. It's just that if you are choosing to use death as those kinds of big turning points, then you need to do it with some amount of care. And I think Arrow did that well in the beginning, and then poorly as it went along, and then incredibly well in this finale, which is why I did really like it, is because it got back to that, found ways to find meaning in death, and I really appreciated that, because that was something that it was really good at.
One of the things I'll always remember about Arrow is how often it could be its own worst enemy. You talk about how that show handled death early on, and I even think the first time it did a story of resurrection, when it did Sarah Lance's death, her first fake, not death, when she fell off the boat, and then her actual death on the island, and then her resurrection and her coming back into Oliver's life. I think they used that really well, but then again, it becomes a device, and then they have to repeat that same pattern with Thea, and then they do it with Roy, and then they do it with Oliver, and then we get to Crisis, and they do it with Oliver again. And it's like, okay, all right now, like, enough is enough. Like, you're undercutting some of the things you do good, which has kind of always been the thing about Arrow. Anytime they would introduce something awesome, they would undercut it with a terrible storyline. If you think about the arc of Deathstroke and the aftermath of that, and how, like, just how much that meant to the impact of that series dramatically, then you also think about how that show was also doing everything that it did with Laura Lance at the time on the same series, or Thea Queen, and you remember, oh yeah, the things Arrow was very good at, it could also be very bad at, which on some hand frustrated me, especially during the show's middle years, its fourth and fifth seasons, but in the end, it became something I appreciated, because, eventually you learn, especially with a series that gets to run this long, is you have a different appreciation for what a show does well across 150 than you do across, say, 40 or 50. You come to appreciate the good and the bad and the whole picture of a series. And I think Arrow, I'll always appreciate what Arrow did poorly, because it did those same things so well when it was focused. And I think that shines through in the finale. I guess the last thing I would really have to say about the finale is John Diggle gets the salmon ladder and the Green Lantern ring, which, even though the CW is never going to be able to afford a Green Lantern series, knowing that they can pull in David Ramsey to any of their other shows at any point just to be like, oh, Green Lantern found a problem on Earth and he had to show up for it for a little while, is kind of cool. It's a nice nod to the one character of the main cast that didn't really get a solid ending. And although there is certainly an argument to be made that the show's most prominent minority character, they could never really figure out as a person beyond the basic notes of, but I think David Ramsey embodied that role so well that it's almost deserving that the actor becomes Green Lantern and not the character in some strange way.
It was nice that they gave him that, and that he was the one to speak at the funeral as well. The only thing I guess that I'd add, which we didn't mention, which didn't really occur to me yet, was that this is also kind of new territory for the CW in terms of endings. Supernatural is in its final season right now, which has been their longest running series.
Season.
But Arrow has far and away been the most popular thing to come out of the CW in the last decade.
Until Riverdale, of course.
Yeah.
Which now is its own universe and has like 4 shows. One of them that's on Netflix, because what is 2020?
So not only is this the end of Arrow, and not only is it, in addition, a transition for the Arrowverse, but it's also the first time in a long time that the CW / WB has had to deal with concluding one of its flagship series. So yeah, it's probably a really emotional time for everybody involved over there.
And I just love that it's because the CW, they couldn't even do that, and they had to throw in a backdoor pilot for the second to last episode of your most iconic series from the past decade. Like, they're like, yo, we gotta hedge our bets here, man. Like, this is we only got one more shot to do this. We can't do it during the finale. Like, fuck it, let's do it. Let's go. Let's try and keep this ball running. Put the hood back up, baby. Which I got, at some level, I got to appreciate.
Oh yeah, how can you possibly be more CW than that?
And I think with time, the woman, I think it's Catherine McNamara, who plays Mia Queen. I think if that became a series, she could be a good lead for it. I think they need to figure out how to write Mia Queen before they do that, but there's certainly promise there for this series, this idea to continue should they decide to do a futuristic Arrow spin-off, sequel, reboot, reimagining, whatever.
Yeah.
Because I guess it's kind of all of those at the same time.
Yeah.
But I think with that, we've emptied our quiver on the series.
Ooh, nice segue.
One might say. And we can shift to another series finale that focuses on dead people with The Good Place, which aired its season finale like 2 days after the Arrow ended. The Good Place ended Thursday, which was, I don't know, the 30th. Well, who cares what date it was? The Good Place ended. It was on NBC for 4 years. It was a show that came with a lot of hype because it came from Mike Schur, who's done a lot of great television over the years. And I think you and I might... Well, I wonder. You and I have never really talked about this show. I think The Good Place... It's one of those things that it was a good thought experiment that turned into a great show that then turned into a less engaging thought experiment as it continued to barrel through story beat after story beat after story beat, and eventually winds its way to what is actually a pretty incredible final episode. I think divorced from a lot of what happens in the 2.5 seasons or so that comes before it. If you look at it as a whole, I wonder how effective The Good Place is as a series and what its impact is. But I think the episode's final statement, kind of as a reflection on existence, is kind of a really touching final piece of work. I don't know. Again, I think there's debate to whether it fits within the series as a whole and how the series viewed these kinds of things. But I think what that series aims to say is a rather touching thing, especially in its last 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah.
What do you think about The Good Place, Sean?
Oh, what do I think about The Good Place? The first thing, I was surprised that of the 3 finales that we're talking about, that this was far and away my favorite one. Because my relationship with The Good Place has always been ambivalent. Would be going like too far in a negative direction. I've always thought that this has been a very good show, but the reaction to that first season was so overwhelmingly positive. Basically, it puts me into the same headspace, or it did back then at least, uh, that I am with Fleabag, which I've now seen twice because I've just really been trying to wrap my head around why people like it as much as they do. And I was trying to, I when the first season aired and it ended, The Good Place, um, the reaction to it was so incredibly positive in like a we're really impressed because this is one of the best written shows on TV kind of way that just kind of had me scratch my head. And uh, like, why? Because it had a couple good twists. Like, that's such an easy thing to do on paper. Um, and it seemed like a lot of people lost steam with it as it went on, and they realized, like, oh, it was good at that thing, but they can't reuse similar techniques. And so now we've kind of just lost interest in it because it's not the formally experimental show that we thought it was. And the reason why I've always thought it's been a very good show and why this was such an incredible finale is because all of that was kind of just structural to me. Like, this has always been a character driven series that has been interested in finding the humanity with these five, well, four people, one demon, and one whatever you want to call Janet.
Fifth Element.
Yeah. um, and the finale paid incredible homage to that. Like, they couldn't have done that aspect of it, that heart of the series, which is finding the best endpoints for these characters. They couldn't have done that better. And it was what I've always thought the series is, which I feel was a bit at odds with what people were saying when it was first airing.
So I'm going to do the thing where I jump back on my Lost horse again for a minute.
Let's do it.
I think there's so many similarities between the Good Place and its premise and kind of how it plays itself out as a series. I think one of the reasons so many people latched on to the good season finale, the first season finale, is because I think for a lot of people, it may have been the first big story twist on a broadcast series that really truly surprised people since Lost did the we have to go back to the island, and you realize that everything that you had seen for that entire season and what you thought were flashbacks were actually flash forwards, and we were seeing the results of events play out kind of in front of our eyes. I mean, people would point to obviously the Red Wedding, but I think there's a definite separation between the expectations of surprise and narrative twists on a cable series, especially when it comes to deaths of characters, than you do on a network series, and Lost spawned many imitations after it came out with shows trying to recreate the moment where they find the door, or when, like I said, when Jack meets Kate at the airport and says, "Hey, we have to go back," and you realize that everything has happened afterwards. I think The Good Place, the first season finale, was the first time that anyone had been genuinely surprised in that way since then. And I think that's why so many people latched onto it, because if you step back and kind of look at that first season, it's a couple interesting story ideas. It's some superficial philosophy things, which I would even argue that I think Lost, when it dug into different philosophies about life and existence and humanity and community, was able, just by nature of being an hour-long series that took place in a somewhat more realistic setting, could explore those things more. But I think The Good Place was the closest template that we've had to that on broadcast television in a while, and made it a really easy thing to attract to. Now, I think it follows that Lost template, unfortunately, of finding too many narrative diversions to throw itself into, and I think The Good Place's audacity to always have twists was something both to admire and to be frustrated with, and I think for a lot of people that's why I think people fell off during season 2 and especially during season 3, just because that show had a willingness to try anything and reinvent its world and change its universe and completely shift where its characters were on a moment's notice. And while that's an exciting proposition, it also limits kind of how much your series can do over the span of a season or multiple seasons or the arc of a series. And I think that's why I enjoyed the finale divorced from the series that came before it so much. If I think about it as a whole of the series, I kind of like lose the thread halfway through. And I'm like, okay, well then, how did you get from that place to this place? And it takes a lot of twisting, mental twisting to get from one place to the other. But I think this finale on its own, standing alone, does exactly what the Lost finale does. It's a finale about realizing that the people that you love are the people you can lean on when it's time to face the prospect of letting go, whether it's of a period of your life or it's of your own existence yourself. And that if you spend your life trying to be better and to love your family and just to live a decent life, there is reward in that, in the peace that you get from that. And I think both of those finales find that truth in some really interesting ways. I think a lot of the imagery in the Good Place finale is directly from Lost, like the trees that never seem to end, the idea of walking through a door and what that can mean kind of metaphorically. Like a lot of it follows that template. And I think of these three, The Good Place may have been the worst at doing it as a series, but as a finale really captures it kind of in a bottle in a powerful way.
It wouldn't at all surprise me, just given that Michael Schur, and when we talk about BoJack, Raphael Bob Waksberg, both huge fans of television as a medium. And it's not a stretch to think that Lost would be on their minds consciously.
And I think Schur even like worked with Lindelof, like talked to him about how to arc out a series or something like that. But I think it's less that and more the thematic stuff I find to be interesting. Mm-hmm. But it's structurally, I think the Good Place finale is kind of a fascinating episode.
What you were saying about the heart of that the people you love are the ones that you can lean on. I guess while I was watching The Good Place, that aspect of it seemed to always be there and always to be the most important part of it for me, and all of the ability and willingness to reinvent itself was kind of a framing device, or it was on the periphery. And this probably speaks to just how I watch television in general. I mean, even thinking about the most stylized things that I've seen, stuff like Hannibal, stuff like Rectify or Enlightened, things that I find really important and dear to me individually. Like, even with all of that, I would still call Hannibal a love series at its core. Like, that's how I most easily identify it. So it probably is just how I watch things, which made me, I guess, predisposed to not falling out of favor with The Good Place. But in the same sense, because it was preoccupied with trying to reinvent itself, I guess some of the attention was taken away from that, which just meant that it never really evolved out of being just a very good series for me. And it never got to the same heights of something like a Parks and Recreation or the better seasons of Community, or if you look at half-hour shows more generally outside of the network sitcom, something like a BoJack Horseman, which we'll talk about, or something like an Enlightened, or a lot of the stuff that's been coming out recently, like Atlanta or Rami or Better Things. It was always just very good, and I feel like if it had leaned more on those characters in the same way that it does in this finale, it would have been even better and maybe reached those heights. But then that's not really what it was trying to do, so I can't really fault it for that.
The comparison from The Good Place and Rectify, I think, is a strong one, because The Good Place really is just Rectify with a CGI budget, kind of, and the willingness to completely change its setting. Like, Rectify works because of its setting, and I would even argue that The Good Place's first season is the best season of the series because it spends the entire time in one setting and can really dig into that and that community and what all that means. Even before it reveals it's a sham, there's still powerful storytelling and character work being done there. And I think the more and more we talk about it, and when you mention Rectify, it kind of all clicks into place for me that The Good Place's constant reinvention eventually felt like an indulgence, an unnecessary indulgence, and Rectify's commitment to its setting as an important, integral part of its character work and storytelling is kind of what separates it. Even though, at the core, they're very, very different shows and how they're filmed and acted and written and all that. The ideas are very much the same, especially if you look at someone like Eleanor and someone like Daniel Holden. Yeah, it's an interesting train of thought to follow.
I really just loved how this finale said goodbye to all of its characters as well. Chidi's ending felt appropriate. I was worried that they were going to find a way to have them both leave at the same time, because a lot of this show has been about their connection. But it made a lot more sense to do it the way that they did.
It may be their smartest choice of this whole finale and how it's constructed and what they're trying to say is having those two leave at separate times. I think it is the smartest decision in that finale.
Yeah, and all of the ways that they grappled with the bigger questions of different conceptions from different belief systems about the afterlife, not addressing certain questions for fear of coming down hard on any kind of answer, and looking at this, to me as a viewer, like the big issue of what happens when there's still something that needs to be done, like how you can't move on to the next stage of your life, or in this case your death, until you've accomplished whatever that thing is, and not attaching, any word like destiny or something heavy like that. Just that feeling of there's still something left for me to do, and they explored that in multiple ways and in different ways, which felt really thought through and very genuine to the characters.
Very Buddhist in a lot of ways, the oneness of it all, and finding, kind of completing your inner circle and finding harmony in that.
Yeah, Michael's ending might have been my favorite as well.
I really like how her personal ending plays into the last scene and Michael's final moments, and just kind of how, like, her impact on the universe, quote unquote, and the reality of her world and our world even, and the impact that we can have on the world if we do something that makes it just a little bit better for somebody else, then it may be worth it. And that is, it's a simplistic notion, but it's a powerful one. And I think how it plays out in him getting a letter for a discount card at a grocery store, it's it plays that old colloquialism that, the most meaningful things happen and the littlest moments and the most insignificant things can be the most important. And I think it does that in a very poetic way that doesn't feel cheap or plastic in any way.
I totally agree. That seemed to be what it was really trying to do as a series at the end of the day, and I think it accomplished that more often than it didn't when it was trying to, which is probably the biggest compliment that you can give it.
And I don't think I have anything else to say about The Good Place. It was a series that I wish I had connected with more in its middle seasons, because I enjoyed a lot of the first season, but the middle seasons never felt... Like, the philosophical stuff is what really interested me, and how they were going to integrate this into this whole debate over what is the meaning of our existence and what should we draw from that? And those debates were always interesting, but it always kind of felt like we were just getting the first 3 paragraphs of a Wikipedia page. Like, it didn't feel like, I'm sure the people that worked on the show researched it, but the nature of it being a 22-minute long episode every week was that you can't really dig into those ideas and let them play out in your story in more than very simplistic ways that a lot of times you have to explain to the audience. I think if that show had kind of found a world that it could stay in for a while and circumstances and rules that kind of stayed consistent, it could have been a little more experimental in how it used metaphor to explore the different ideas it had about philosophy and different philosophers and how their ideas may play out in this playground, this kind of existential playground that is the afterlife as constructed by the people of the good place and the bad place. But hey, we got the 4 seasons we got, and we can move on to BoJack Horseman, which ended on Friday when the final 8 episodes of season 6, I believe it was its 6th season, premiered on Netflix. I am very surprised that BoJack got as many seasons and episodes as it did, especially as Netflix started to cut out some of its more, I don't want to say creative endeavors, but some of its more experimental stuff. I think of something like Sense8 that died after 2 seasons, and again, Sense8 had budgetary concerns and things like that, but BoJack kind of is the last vestige of the first era of Netflix, and you can feel that in these final 8 episodes because they feel very different than anything I've watched that's come out of Netflix in the past few years.
Yeah, some of that must have been because of the cost of producing this, which would have been much less than something like A House of Cards or An Orange is the New Black.
Sure, Kevin Spacey's salary cost more than most of the production of the first season of BoJack.
Isn't that sad? And what came out of it was a show that was way better than anybody expected it to be. This was high in most people's end of the decade lists, and appropriately so. I don't want what I think of as the slight decline in quality in the second half of this series, so seasons 4, 5, and 6, to suggest anything other than this was one of the best things that we've got in the last decade. Like, this is still, at the end of the day, I think, a top tier series, even though I felt like it could have ended much sooner. And that's not because these last few seasons and this finale weren't producing good material. It just felt like a lot of it was retreading themes, arcs, and beats, it's hard to criticize that because part of looking at BoJack as a character is figuring out and seeing how he deals with his cyclical nature. Like, he needs to repeat some of his mistakes. Like, that's who he is. That's how Mad Men functioned with Don Draper. And Mad Men is absolutely the closest parallel of a series to BoJack out there. But I guess maybe it was just that Mad Men had so many other things around it that were really worth investing time and that kept the viewer's interest. It just felt like what BoJack resorted to was just kind of some clever and meta comedy, whether that was the structural designs to some of the seasons, or just whatever the jokes were within an episode. Some of the episodes were designed around a joke. And actually, that format, I think, was another thing that kind of made me really stick with my belief that it should have ended much earlier, is that those one-off episodes, those special episodes that happened early on, felt really organic and inspired. And rather than that being the reason for those existing in these later seasons, it felt like they just realized that those episodes were successes, and that they wanted to include some things like that. So they kind of set that as challenges to find those other stories that might do these one-off episodes, whether, that's going into Princess Carolyn's history with her family, or doing a whole episode that's a eulogy. These kinds of experimental things. It felt less organic, and it felt more like I could see the writing as it was happening, which kind of irked me a little bit. But I think the only reason it did is because this show is so good that it forces you to pay attention in those ways.
I would agree. I think the eulogy episode in particular is where I detached from the series for a little bit. Well, I guess kind of for the rest of its run, because like you discussed, a lot of this series by design is retreads upon itself as it goes on. All of BoJack's stories that were relevant in season 1 are relevant in the final season. All of his patterns are being repeated in the first half of the season, and the second half of the season that just released is all about the fallout of that and kind of trying to find a new cycle for BoJack to live his life on within that. And while that's an interesting idea, I think it's dramatically limiting, and I think even Mad Men ran into this problem sometimes, even though it benefited from having a certain richness around it that it consistently stuck to. I think if anything sticks out to me about these last couple BoJack seasons is that it moved a little bit away from its balance of being a Hollywood satire and a character drama, and instead really became a drama about depression, which has plenty of interesting components of its own and interesting ways to form comedy around it and interesting ways to tell experimental stories with it, like as it did with the episode where it plays Caroline's life out in any number of different directions as she's trying to, be a mother and be a woman and be a boss and be an employee and be trying to do all these different things at the same time, and how that all molds together. I think that was in the first half of season 6. But I think I look at characters like Todd, who kind of their journeys mostly ended by season 4, and then he kind of went into wacky side character role for the rest of the series. Like there's this kind of half-hearted arc about him trying to reconnect with his mom that never really comes together and disappears, and like all the Hollywood, like when they do the Hollywood sign bit in the final episode, it was kind of a reminder of how little this show had been a Hollywood satire in its last handful of episodes. It's weird to think about how much BoJack changed while it was still repeating itself in its final year, and I think that, for me, really is what speaks to your argument about how, of all 3 of these series, I guess Arrow's thing is that it always tried to tell different series. I don't know why I'm being talked to by my phone, but that's technology in 2020. But BoJack is the one that repeated itself the most, it feels like, and I think that's kind of what dulled the impact of these final episodes for me, and what has left me a little more conflicted, I think, than a lot of our colleagues who have heaped a lot of praise on this final season.
The issue is that it's still good. Like, these are good episodes. It's a good series. It's just... Your point about Todd, I think, could be expanded and applied to almost everything in the series.
Like Caroline and Judah getting married?
Yeah.
For example? Like, that stuff kind of sticks out like a sore thumb in ways that nothing in these other 2 finales do. Strangely enough.
It just felt like there were probably only, at most, 4th seasons worth of material to really explore here, and the rest was padded out with retreading that didn't add enough layering afterwards. So, just looking at Todd and the ups and downs of his character, like, for him to kind of end up as the same person as when the series started, not in terms of like, obviously what he's gone through has changed his interior character.
But he's basically a more self-aware version of the same dumbass.
Yeah, and is this the point of BoJack Horseman, the series, is to bring all 5 of its main characters back to the same point, just with more awareness, more reflection. I'm not sure that it is, and if it is, then to have that be the end goal for all 5 of them, I think that's not worth the kind of praise, and that doesn't speak to the depth of writing that I think the writing room really exhibited in those first 3 seasons, mostly seasons 2 and 3. But in the first half of the series, like, there was some of those arcs I think were just really smart, and some of those one-off episodes really had us look at 1 or 2 of these characters in ways that we hadn't seen them before, and in ways where you look at them much differently afterwards.
All right, jumping back on the Lost Source again.
Okay, let's do it.
I think where the biggest comparison between these 2 series are for me is how I have to admit it, the BoJack finale disappoints me a little bit, not because of what it does with BoJack per se, but in how it feels like it gives us a glimpse of every other character in kind of a way that reminds us that there was a lot of if they were going to finish telling a story, they probably should have finished telling theirs. You know, I look at the Lost finale and what it does when it is kind of... It's hard to define because there's flash backwards, flash sideways, flash forwards, and then the flashes in the final episode are kind of a different thing altogether. But when you see the other characters that kind of came back for the finale that they have in cameos, and you realize, oh, there was parts of this arc that never got fleshed out, and there was all this stuff that I wanted to see with them. The BoJack finale is that to a T for me. Like, you know, we get more than enough of what happens to BoJack, but what Diane goes through that she explains to BoJack in that final scene, what Princess Caroline goes through in her path to end up marrying Judah, Todd, there's just everything about where BoJack finishes feels like it was too much and not enough. I think as a television episode, I think this is the worst of the 3 of them. Strangely enough, which, you know, if you had asked me a month ago, I would have never even considered a legible thought. But I think this final episode just kind of shrugs its shoulders at so many of its characters and the journeys that they've asked us to invest so much time into, that it's weird. Even Diane's entire speech in this final episode is framed as a part of BoJack's realization and not necessarily an organic ending or anything for her character. Like, I know this show had an adherence to real life and how we go through life and slowly evolve as humans and experience a shitload of disappointment, but how this finale frames that, and it does so by kind of jumping past points with its characters, important points, is a bit disappointing in the end for me. I didn't feel a lot at the end of the BoJack finale, which I didn't expect to happen.
When Mad Men ended, it brought Don Draper to a place of semi-enlightenment, had drug him through all this hell through 7 seasons, much of it self-induced. But having come out the other end, better prepared to be a person in the world, and it seemed like BoJack as a series was always working towards that, and I don't feel like, maybe with the exception of Diane, who of the 5 characters I guess felt the most satisfying, but still not enough. It seemed like it was trying to do that, and it just really fell short of that. But that might be me misreading the intentions. But that was the show that I was watching. It was always working towards getting these characters to become, or at least to try to become, better, and to give them a push in the right direction in order to be more functional. And like you said, too much and not enough. Like, it didn't make good on that, and we got a bunch of other things that we probably didn't need in the process.
Like, when you say that, what pops to head for me is like the dozen episodes we spend with Mr. Peanut Butter and his girlfriend, and then Mr. Peanut Butter's his entire series arc ends with him getting dumped, and that's it. Like, that's literally it. We come back to him when BoJack gets out of jail, and he's just BoJack's friend, and there's really no other surrounding information we get to Mr. Peanut Butter at all. And it just felt like, for a show that was so carefully constructed to fully flesh out the journeys of these characters, to kind of sidestep this in the final hour like that is like a super bummer. Like, it's really disappointing how little so many of these characters play into the impact of these final episodes. And even with somebody like Diane, it's kind of left to being speechified.
I wouldn't feel as strongly about this if I didn't think this was such a good show. And I think this is the one of these three that's going to have more and more significant impacts on the rest of television going forward. Not in a huge way, not in the same way of a Game of Thrones or a Lost or some of the other shows that we refer back to pretty often. But this series did a lot. I think it bridged a lot of the bias against animated series. So anything now that comes out that's animated or anthropomorphized that aims to be at all serious is going to be taken more seriously at a base level because of how good this series was. I think it won over a lot of people in that way. And I know from talking with people that bias against animation does still exist. And that's unfortunate, but it's just something that is what it is. And, this was one of the key series. The last decade was defined by these half-hour series that are they comedy? Not really. Like, the biggest moments tend to be these more weighty, dramatic beats, and BoJack was one of them. And I think it has been one of the key figures in that group of series that has really dissolved the traditional genres in that way, which I think is for the better.
And it kind of bookends. You mentioned the Sopranos as kind of the opening of this genre of prestige male anti-hero. It was a cinematic thing for 50 years, but talking about this modern era television and that specific type of character. And BoJack is kind of, I think the comparisons to Mad Men are probably the most potent and accurate, but there's a lot of similarities to draw between Tony Soprano and BoJack Horseman, especially in how their series end, and they kind of just continue on with, the trying to find yourself in the ordinary bullshit of everyday life and how going through that defines you as a person. If there's one thing I can point to that BoJack does well at the end is just kind of that there's no big proclamation, there's no big dramatic event. Like, the finale is like there's a wedding, but we don't really even see it. Like, the focus is distinctly not on that big life event. It's about BoJack coming home, living his regular life for a day, and just realizing that no matter how much he improves or what changes, that life is still going to throw the same shit at you all the time. And I think BoJack and the Sopranos are kind of the beginning and the end of that era of the male anti-hero who's just complicated enough for us to invest in him, but still has plenty of qualities that we can hate.
This is a much less interesting point, but it harkens back to something I forgot to say about The Good Place as well. BoJack in its finale did better for me as a reader with its literary references by, I think, intentionally alluding to Oz, the prison series that debuted before HBO, which had a season structured around the prison doing a rendition of Macbeth. But the fact that BoJack is doing Hedda Gabler for this was a much better literary inclusion than The Good Place even daring to suggest that Shakespeare would do part 2 of The Tempest, and that the majority of his 400 plays in the afterlife were not very good. So I'll give BoJack that.
Yeah, that Shakespeare joke is a weird one. That's one of those post-millennial hot literary takes. I feel like is now we got to say Shakespeare wasn't as good as he was just because that guy's been propped up for 200 years. Let's point out he's got to be terrible now.
We could genuinely have an entire discussion about that, and you'd really hear me rage.
I think we'll keep our rage to the television at hand today. I think I've kind of expressed everything I kind of didn't feel about the BoJack finale, I guess. Of the three, I expected my reaction to this one to be the strongest, and probably my reaction to Arrow to be the weakest. And I think The Good Place is the best of these three. I think Arrow with Sarah Lance may have the most touching component of all three of them, just considering her arc over the last 7 or 8 years of television that character's been with us. But I think BoJack, I think you're correct, and BoJack's the most meaningful and probably will have the most lasting impact, both in how it shifts what people think about the animation genre, but in also how it kind of bookends a very certain era of character-driven television. Not that television won't be character-driven moving forward, but specifically focused on, let's say, very morally compromised male characters.
Yeah, BoJack is the one. Well, it's the only one so far that I've gone back to rewatch, and it's probably the one that I would soonest rewatch in the near future. It's the one that I probably recommended the most out of these three. Arrow was really hard to recommend. I basically, if I did talk to anybody about it, it'd be like, just watch the season 1 finale and then start from there. But I think BoJack is very easily and unequivocally easy to recommend, and The Good Place is kind of in the middle there, where it's a nice thing to have on. It's quite comforting, but is it the best of the network sitcoms of the last decade? Not so much. So if I do watch it again,
it's short enough.
Yeah, it is
that
short.
Plays to its credit is that you can kind of bang through it. It's 50 some episodes. Like, it's not a long ride.
Yeah, and that would be why I would go back to rewatch it. But I don't think that will happen probably for a couple years at least.
Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm actually incorrect. BoJack is not the era, the last show of the era of shows that try to justify the existence of a piece of shit human. There is still one left. It is called Young Sheldon.
Oh, Young Sheldon.
Young Sheldon. That is still a thing. Anyway, I don't think... I would love to be talking about the series finale of Young Sheldon, but right now, unfortunately, that show will continue to exist beyond these three fine dramatic series that we enjoyed. Sean, you have any last thoughts on series finales in general, or these three in particular?
None of these will go down as among my favorite, but that's only because we've had some incredible series finales in the past. Most notably, a series that you're watching, I believe, for the first time right now. So I look forward to talking about that once you're done.
Yes. I don't think we need to be cryptic. I'm watching Spartacus right now. I'm trying to watch through it a little bit slower. I'm trying to fill in some gaps of my prestige knowledge, but do it in a way that is better serving to me in the long term, as in not burn through a show in 2 weeks and then forget about it in a month. So I've been trying to watch that slowly. It is hard because it has gotten very good very quickly. I will say right now that I think my biggest takeaway so far is I did not expect Manu Bennett, which, by the way, justifies me talking about this on the podcast because, he was in Arrow as Deathstroke, the best character on that show. I did not realize that guy had the range, but holy shit, he has the range.
It's unbelievable as that series progresses, just how many things go beyond your expectation. No series has ever made me cry more often and harder than Spartacus has.
I'm really impressed. It has a really rough start, but Manu Bennett's performance, and you know what? Let's be honest, his willingness to just be straight up fucking nude all the time and still be like emotionally vulnerable in scenes is like really incredible. Like some of the work he does when he's on the screen with like Lucy Lawless is just, it's really impressive.
Okay.
Not expected. Did not expect.
I'm going to rewatch it, and then we're going to do a massive Spartacus episode, and it's going to be a beautiful day in both of our lives.
Woohoo! I'm sure we'll be talking about Spartacus next week. Since we're at the end of this show, I can let you guys know we're talking about next week, as we always do. We are going to be doing the episode we thought we were going to do last week, talking about not necessarily the 10 best action scenes of all time on television, but the 10 most important, the 10 most iconic, the 10 most genre-defining action scenes of the last generation on television.
From our
And
perspective.
our picks for those. Yeah, from our humble perspectives. Are we humble?
We're also informed.
Yeah, we're slightly humble, slightly more informed. I'll go with that. With that, I think we're at the end of the show. I don't have anything else. Sean, you got anything else?
Nope, just the 2 shows that we need to talk about every week.
Oh, yes. We'll be back next week to talk about those 2 shows, Ozark and Glow. And until then, fucking go enjoy some television.